It began with a whisper in the hollow, carried through the fog that never lifted. Old folks used to say the mountains could hide anything, a body, a sin, even an entire bloodline that should never have been. And deep in a forgotten corner of the Appalachian range, they were right. There was a family that time itself tried to bury. But bones have a way of speaking, even when no one wants to hear. They called them the Harrows, though that name wasn't their first, and certainly not their last. Every few decades, the spelling changed, the pronunciation softened, until the truth was swallowed whole. But if you trace the roots far enough, you find one story standing out like a wound that never healed. A son who married his own mother, under the shadow of the mountains that watched and said nothing. Locals don't talk about it anymore. Not because they've forgotten, but because memory itself became dangerous. There are things you can't unsee, things you can't unknow once you've looked them in the face. But back then, in the early years of the 1900s, there was a kind of isolation in those woods that made anything possible. Families didn't come down from the ridge much. Outsiders didn't go up. Roads were thin, food was scarce, and blood was the only currency that could be trusted. It started with a woman named Clara Harrow. Pale as river clay, quiet as snowfall. Her husband, Thomas, went missing in a timber accident when she was still young, leaving her with one son, Elijah. Folks said she barely spoke after that, just worked the land, eyes hollowed by grief. They lived alone in a shack so deep in the holler that even the mailman refused to go that far. But what grief becomes after too many winters, that's the part no one can explain. Some say it turns to madness, some say it turns to need. And for Clara and Elijah, need was all they had left. He grew tall and broad like his father before him, with the same hands, the same eyes. Neighbors started noticing how close they were, how she leaned on his arm a little too long, how he looked at her not like a boy should. In the mountains, gossip is currency, and silence is a weapon. So when the preacher's wife caught sight of them one spring morning, walking hand in hand, Clara in a white dress that wasn't new but wasn't morning black either, she didn't tell a soul. She didn't have to. The mountain took that secret and held it close. But the kind of sin that grows in the dark doesn't stay quiet forever. It was years later that anyone dared go up there again. A census taker from Charleston. He was looking for families off the official maps, trying to update the records that hadn't been touched in 20 years. The road ended long before he reached the Harrow property. What he found was a single cabin, its chimney coughing weak smoke, the woods around it so still that even the birds seemed to have gone silent. Inside were two people, a man, mid-30s maybe, and a woman far older, her face half hidden behind her hair. They said their name was Harrow, husband and wife. But the man's eyes, the same blue as the woman's, the same slope to the brow, told another story. The census taker wrote the names down anyway. He didn't ask questions. But later that night, back in town, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just witnessed something unholy. Months later, when the county tried to send a preacher up there, the house was empty. No tracks, no fire smoke, just silence, and two chairs still pulled close to the hearth. It was as if they'd been swallowed whole. And yet, the story didn't die. Because years after that, strange children started appearing in nearby hollers. Blue-eyed, pale-skinned, with faces too symmetrical to belong to strangers. They claimed no father, no mother. But when someone asked where they came from, the answer was always the same: up the ridge, from the Harrow place. People began to whisper that the Harrows weren't gone, only hiding, living deeper in the woods generation after generation, marrying within, keeping the bloodline pure, or poisoned. By the 1950s, local law enforcement refused to go near that part of the county. Dogs went missing there. Hikers never came back. And when a forest fire swept through in '57, volunteers claimed they saw figures moving through the smoke, pale as ghosts, barefoot, watching from the treeline. Those who've studied Appalachian isolation, the genetic bottlenecks, the histories of closed communities, know that such stories aren't always just myths. Sometimes they're records of a lineage that's been quietly erasing itself from history, not through war or famine but through its own walls. There's a file, buried in a West Virginia archive, that still lists an E. Harrow and wife. No maiden name given. No date of birth. Just a note scribbled in the margins. Uncooperative. Possible mental infirmity. The ink is faded, but if you look closely, you can almost feel the hesitation of the pen. Whoever wrote it must have known something they couldn't say. It said that when the Harrow cabin was finally found, decades later, the wood was rotted through, yet a single photograph still clung to the wall. It showed a young man and a woman, standing close, her hand resting on his chest. The back of the photograph bore 3 words. We were one. No official record ever confirmed their relation. No birth certificates, no marriage licenses. But the rumors spread like roots beneath the earth. And even now, locals claim the bloodline still runs. Diluted, hidden, waiting. Because in those mountains, blood doesn't just bind. It remembers, and sometimes it wants to start over. There are stories that rot in the dark, and then there are the ones that keep growing, like mold across old wood. The Harrow bloodline was one of those. It didn't die when the cabin burned. Scattered. Pieces of it drifted down into the towns below, into the logging camps, the mill houses, the mining shacks where names got traded like currency. No one said Harrow anymore, but sometimes, a man would walk into a bar with eyes too pale to look real, and folks would whisper, "Mountain blood." By the late 1960s, the hills had changed. Roads had been cut, power lines strung, and the outside world began to seep in like water through stone. But still, some valleys never saw light. There were places you could drive through with your windows up and still feel like you'd entered another century. The old people there talked about the kin, never by name, just the kin. The ones who didn't mix, didn't talk, didn't leave. A social worker once tried to find them. 1974. Her name was Margaret Sloan. Young, eager, newly assigned to a rural outreach program meant to uplift the Appalachian poor. She lasted less than a month. In her final report, half the pages were blank, but what she did write was enough to make the state shut down the entire project. She said there were children in those woods who spoke their own language. Words that weren't English, weren't anything. Faces that looked like reflections of one another. She said one boy called her Mama the moment he saw her. And when she asked his name, he said, Elijah, the same name from the census record, half a century earlier. Margaret left the county the next morning. Never came back. Years later, when she was interviewed for a local radio piece about Appalachian folklore, she refused to discuss it. Only said one thing before hanging up. Some families don't die. They just fold inward until there's nothing left but memory. And yet, the memory of the Harrows never stopped bleeding through. In 1981, hikers stumbled upon a crude stone marker deep off an unmarked trail. It was carved by hand, letters jagged and uneven, reading, C+E forever joined. Locals who saw it said it was old, maybe carved decades before. But some said the moss that grew over it looked freshly disturbed, as if someone had cleared it just weeks prior. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If your family tree circled back on itself over and over until you couldn't tell where it began? Because the deeper you dig, the less it looks like history, and the more it looks like a curse. By the time the 1990s rolled in, the story had turned into a kind of whispered challenge among locals. Teenagers dared each other to go up into Harrow Hollow after dark. A few did. Most came back. The ones who didn't were written off as runaways, drifters, addicts. But there was one story that stuck. A pair of brothers who hiked up the ridge with flashlights and a camera, planning to make a joke tape about the Inbred ghost clan. Only one of them made it back. He never spoke a word again. When authorities found him wandering the logging road the next morning, barefoot and covered in mud, the camera was gone. But what they found in his pocket was worse, a photograph. Faded, black and white, water damaged. It showed a woman standing in front of a cabin. Her eyes were blank, empty, and her hand rested on the shoulder of a man who looked exactly like the boy holding it. The sheriff burned the photo before it hit the papers. The boy was sent to a psychiatric facility downstate. Some say the Harrows aren't just a family. They're a reflection of something older. something that the mountains themselves remember, a hunger for connection that turned back on itself until it became madness. Because when you live too long with only your own blood to trust, love has nowhere else to go. Geneticists would later call it founder's collapse, a point at which a bloodline folds so many times that identity itself blurs. But in the hollers, they didn't need science to name it. They just called it the binding. A preacher once said he heard crying from deep in the hills one night. Not animal, not human, something caught in between. He followed the sound until the trees thinned and found a clearing with bones arranged in a perfect circle. Deer skulls, small and white, each with a candle melted between the antlers. In the center, an old Bible, pages eaten by rain. The verse still legible on the open page read, "And the two shall become one flesh." He left that night and never went back. When you start piecing these accounts together, the census man, the social worker, the hikers, the preacher, you realize they all describe the same thing. A lineage that refused to die even when it should have. A secret marriage that wasn't just between mother and son, but between blood and memory itself. And maybe that's the worst part, because the more you study their trail, the more you start to see patterns. Names repeating across decades, birth dates looping back, faces copied over like ghosts pressed into new flesh. It's as if the family tree itself is trying to rewrite history, dragging its branches into the present day. Some say descendants of the Harrows live among us now. They change their names, move often, stay quiet. But there's always something, the way their eyes never quite meet yours, or how they seem to know things they shouldn't. A local nurse once told a story about a man who came into her clinic in 2003, pale skin, strange eyes, blood work that made no sense. She said his genetic markers were unlike anything she'd ever seen. When she asked about his parents, he just smiled and said, "My mother and I were very close. No one ever saw him again." And that's the thing about these mountains, they don't forget. They hold on to secrets the way trees hold on to roots. The deeper they go, the harder they are to pull up. And sometimes, it's better not to dot. There's a saying in those hills, that every story echoes, but not every echo fades. The Harrow story never faded. It seeped through veins, through names, through generations that thought they'd left it behind. But blood has memory, and memory, it always finds its way home. By the early 2000s, most of the old-timers who'd whispered about the Harrows were gone. The last of them, a man named Silas Webb, lived in a trailer near what used to be the Harrow property. He kept to himself, didn't own a phone, didn't go into town. But before he died, he told a nurse something strange, that some nights he still saw a light moving through the trees up on the ridge, a lantern swinging slow, and sometimes two silhouettes walking side by side. He said one of them always wore white. Silas's body was found 3 days later. Heart failure, they said. But the coroner's note mentioned something unusual, a photograph found under his pillow. Same as before, a woman and a man. This one, though, looked recent. The background wasn't the old cabin. It was modern. A trailer, maybe, or a prefab home. The woman's hair was gray, the man's dark. But their faces were unmistakable. Identical eyes, identical mouths. The writing on the back said only, "Still one." When I first saw that photo, I thought it was a hoax. Some rural legend dressed up in found footage aesthetics. But the more I looked, the more the details gnawed at me. The clothes were right for the time. The photograph stock, authentic early 2000s. The signature? Same handwriting as the one found decades earlier in the ruins of the old cabin. Someone had been keeping the tradition alive. There's a theory, whispered among genealogists and folklorists who still study these forgotten enclaves, that some families in isolation become addicted to themselves. They see purity where others see sickness, love where others see corruption. They start believing that their union is sacred, that the outside world is the one that's fallen. And in that belief they begin again. Maybe the Harrows weren't trying to hide. Maybe they were trying to preserve something, a bloodline that belonged only to itself. There's a small cemetery near Laurel Fork, overgrown and nameless. Locals call it the family patch. No headstones, just fieldstones. But if you clear the moss off one in the back, you can still make out faint lettering, sage, and beside it, a smaller stone. When archaeologists surveyed the site, they found bones that told a story in silence. Generations of close relation, male to female, parent to child. The kind of genetic collapse you only see when a family has turned completely inward. But here's the part that chills me. The bones were fresh, not ancient, less than 40 years old. Who buried them? No one knows. Every attempt to trace the Harrow bloodline through official records hits a wall. Missing documents, burned courthouses, names that vanish between censuses. Yet every few years someone finds a piece. A photo, a locket, a letter written in the same hand that's been writing for over a century. It's as if time itself refuses to break the chain. Maybe you've passed one of them on the road without realizing. The eyes are what give them away. Too light, too clear, almost glassy. They don't blink as much. They look at you like they already know who you are. A gas station clerk once said a woman came in during a storm, asking for kerosene. She was calm, polite, but strange. She said she needed it for the lamp. When he handed it to her, their hands brushed, and he said her skin was cold, like stone. As she left, he asked where she was staying. She just smiled and said, "Home, up the ridge." He never saw her car. He quit the job the next week. What if this isn't just a story about one family? What if it's a warning about what happens when isolation becomes devotion? When love turns in on itself until it has no form left but obsession. Historians like to believe that time erases the worst of us. But sometimes time protects it, wraps it in myth, in moss, in quiet, until we forget it's still breathing under the soil. And maybe that's what the Harrows are now. Not a name, not a bloodline, but an echo. A memory that lives in anyone who's ever looked in the mirror and seen too much of their past staring back. I once asked an old genealogist, the kind who spends her life chasing lost families through courthouse archives, what she thought happened to the Harrows. She said something that's never left me. They didn't disappear, she said. They married the mountain. There's a road, just off Route 19, that dead ends at a rusted gate. Beyond it, the forest thickens until no light gets through. Locals say if you go far enough, you'll find a clearing. And if you stand there long enough, the woods will fall silent. You might hear breathing, or footsteps, or maybe nothing at all. Just that feeling that you've walked into someone else's memory. And if you ever see a lantern moving through the trees, don't follow it. Because some bloodlines aren't meant to be found. Some names are meant to stay buried. And in those mountains, beneath the roots and the silence, the Harrows are still waiting, watching, remembering, binding. Forever one.